I mean, you know, look, whether you agree with Mike Joy's figures or not, you've clearly got problems of river pollution. You've clearly got problems with species which are declining, threatened with extinction. And he says the problem is that central government, he's not just blaming you, but over decades, central government in New Zealand has been complacent about this. So what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, so I don't actually totally agree with that proposition. I mean, for a start off, yes, of course the population is getting larger and that creates some form of pollution. And yes, we have a large agricultural base, and so as we've become intensifying our dairying operations, that's had some impact on our river quality. Now what the government has been doing is demanding much higher environmental standards. So actually for the most part, you jump in any New Zealand river or stream, you go and breathe the air, and you walk up a mountain, I'd argue with you that if you don't believe it's clean and green, then you need to show me a country that's cleaner and greener.
Well, I hope someday I can have the opportunity to do at least some of that. It sounds attractive, but let's actually, you've talked about farming, let's get deeper into this farming issue. You talked about Australia and the fact that it's outstripped you in growth terms year upon year recently because it commands vast commodities and minerals wealth, and it's tying itself very closely, frankly, to the Chinese and emerging Asian economies to make very big profits. New Zealand doesn't have the minerals, but it does, and you've talked about it, have a very significant agricultural sector. Are you happy to see China buying into New Zealand's agriculture?
Well, we're happy to have China as a big market, and I think we would define
that's not what I asked you.
No, but I mean, I think it's interesting to have a look at what our options are, because we're masters of our own destiny. So if you look at China, it's now our second largest market. Two-way trade's on its way to, it's 12 billion on its way to 20 billion. So there has been investment from China, and in certain instances, we've welcomed that.
Yeah, Chinese companies want to buy big into New Zealand farming. There's the one particular issue right now, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Crayfar farming group.
Yep.
It's a very big farming group in New Zealand. The Chinese want to buy it.
16 farms.
16 farms. The Chinese want to buy it. It's become a symbol of whether you are going to let China take a significant stake in New Zealand's agricultural economy. Are you going to?
So the correct question to ask is not about whether it's Chinese investment. It's New Zealand's attitude to any investment, because actually in the agricultural space we've been seeing that from Europe, we've certainly been seeing it from the United States, and obviously from China as well.
So what's the answer? Are you going to let Chinese buy this farming?
The answer is we are happy for there to be investment, but we don't want to see New Zealand selling its entire productive base out, and recently the government moved to change the rules around aggregation of farms, so to say that one individual buyer couldn't buy more than 10 farms in New Zealand. Now in the case of the Crayford farms, which are 16 farms that have been in receivership, that's right, that they have been subject to a bid. The process in New Zealand is you go to the Overseas Investment Office at the point at which they make a recommendation that comes to ministers, and ministers then have a number of factors they'll consider. But the issue isn't so much about China.
Well,
it's
there are lots of New Zealanders who think it is. Brian Gaynor, I'm sure you know, commentator in one of your leading papers, an investment analyst, he says Crayford Farms is an important symbol. He says if it is sold to the Chinese, the floodgates could open. He says if one farm goes, many could follow, and he says based on the experience of forestry, which you've also talked about, which is now, he says, mostly overseas owned, this would not be in New Zealand's best interest.
Well, the uniqueness of the Crayford farms is only probably the scale of them, that there's 16, but by definition there's probably 100 farms on the market for sale at the moment. So there's nothing that particularly opens the floodgates because of Crayford farms. What is true, and that's the view that I've certainly taken, is that we believe the 10 to 20 year view for New Zealand is one where we think commodity prices will continue to rise, and New Zealand will play a very important role in feeding the world. We think that that provides a revenue stream that's very important for New Zealand, so we don't want to be tenants in our own land.
One can only assume you think selling off the forest, much of which went to foreign ownership, was a mistake.
Well, I go back to the point, you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of foreign investment, or any investment in New Zealand? And the answer is to lift productivity. So the Chinese recently came in and bought a stake in a dairy company called Synlait. Now that is the major baby food, infant formula supplier in China. So where they brought in money for jobs, where they created value added, we supported that.
Right.
If you're asking me just about the sale of land which is highly developed, I'm not convinced that that actually adds a lot to the overall wealth of New Zealand, or is necessarily hugely in New Zealand's interest.
All right. Well, I find it interesting that you have developed obviously a much closer, very close trading relationship with China, including a major treaty. Let's talk about the other superpower, the real hyperpower, I suppose, still. That is the United States. You've had a very complex relationship with the US and New Zealand over many years. Would you accept that there are still fundamental problems in the relationship with the US?
That's not the way I'd define it, and I don't think it's the way the Americans would define it either. In fact, both the President of the United States of America, President Obama, and Secretary Clinton have been at pains to make the point that the relationship's probably in the best shape it's been since our anti-nuclear legislation in the mid-80s.
Well, that's not saying much, because the relationship's been in horrible shape for a long, long time.
Yeah,
well, you only have to read WikiLeaks. I mean, the US diplomats in New Zealand...
Actually, there wasn't much in WikiLeaks, actually.
In the last 5 or 6 years, at one point, one US diplomat was saying, you know what, we get more real cooperation from Fiji than we do from New Zealand. You know, that's the nature of the relationship over the last decade. Now you...
Actually, that's not correct. So,
I mean, that was...
Well, I would strongly disagree with that, Steve. I'm sorry, but if you look at the role that New Zealand plays in places like Afghanistan, the role that we've played as an honest broker with an independent foreign policy, outward leaning in areas like climate change and others, New Zealand's played a very important role.
What you do not have is active participation in what is supposed to be the overarching sort of military partnership in the region, that is the ANZUS alliance, because since the 80s, since New Zealand took a very firm and adamant anti-nuclear stance, you haven't actually allowed US warships to use your facilities. Is that going to change on your watch?
Well, I don't think it's likely to change. I mean, it's not a position where we stop them. It's just we have a policy where they would need to confirm that their ships were either not nuclear powered or nuclear armed. Well, look,
that's what's happened.
You never say never.
It's frozen that military alliance. Yes. It doesn't function because New Zealand won't play the rules that the US wants to play by.
Actually, I think you need to go and have a look at the more recent comments by the Americans, which have been very much to say, this is an area where we agree to disagree, it's a small rock in the road and we've found a way around that. Actually, the relationship with the US is extremely strong, probably in the, as I say, the best footing it's been for a very long time.
Just to sum up on that one, though, you see no prospect, however many terms you surf, you see no prospect of that changing.
No, it's not going to change. I mean, our anti-nuclear legislation and all that comes with that is fully entrenched in the DNA of New Zealanders, and we have no interest in changing it. We're not going to be changing it. I don't think that is in any way inhibiting our relationship with the United States.
It's interesting you say that, because you know you've been seen as a sort of Cameron figure in New Zealand, a young guy who's come in who wants to shake the country up a bit, you know, do things in a new way. Yeah. Why do you say, oh, we can't change it, it's part of our DNA? I mean, isn't it time New Zealand looked afresh at some of these important global issues?
Well, I guess the first question is how relevant would it really be in the modern environment? I mean, why would New Zealand need to change that? I don't see any particular merit around that, and we've actually got ourselves in a position now where we have a very constructive working relationship with the Americans. We would treat them as allies. We work very closely together. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, I'm interested in fighting the battles of 2011 and beyond, not the ones that took place in 1985.
Well, let's go even further back than that. Let's go back to New Zealand's colonial history. I mean, I asked the question about whether you really are a reformer, a changer of New Zealand, partly because, you know, one of the most fundamental sort of historic realities about New Zealand is that it's part of the Commonwealth. It's sovereign, its monarch is the British Queen.
Correct.
And I just wonder whether it's time to think about that too.
I don't think so, actually.
You did say so. You said, my view is, and this is when you took over, my view is it's inevitable that one day New Zealand will become a republic.
That's right, but not under my watch.
So you'd rather New Zealand be a republic, but you're not prepared to do any work to make it happen?
No, quite the opposite. I actually don't think New Zealand should be a republic, but my view is that probably one day will happen. I mean, these things do evolve, but at the end of the day, what would we be arguing about? We'd be arguing about whether New Zealanders elected their head of state, or whether effectively their government appointed the head of state in the form of the Governor-General. Now, in my mind, there's certainly no great benefit in New Zealand electing a president. I think our historical links actually with the United Kingdom matter a great deal. Personally,
do they really? Now that you've got an unprecedented trade deal with China, we've talked about the way in which the economic balance of power in the world is shifting eastward, and it really matters to New Zealand having a strong relationship with Britain.
In the end, the way that New Zealand sees the world is that we run our own independent foreign policy, but we play, I think, a part in the world where we syndicate the risks of the world. So we play our part in Afghanistan, we play our part in other parts of the world, because we know that we live in a global environment where New Zealanders live and travel. But in the end, if we look at our real friends in the world, I think they are very much the United Kingdom, Australia, the US, Canada and the likes. They are our traditional allies. It doesn't mean that we don't have very strong relationships with other countries. We do.
Sure.
But those historical links, those cultural values and principles that underpin New Zealand society and British society, I think are as relevant today as they were back in 1914 when we headed off to war to support Britain.
A final thought then on that. You've been here in London to attend the royal wedding of Prince William, and that's made people think about the future of the monarchy here in the UK. Do you think New Zealanders' commitment to retaining the current status may change when Queen Elizabeth's reign comes to an end?
I don't think so, actually. The Queen is much loved in New Zealand.
Do New Zealanders want a Charles III as their sovereign, their monarch?
Well, I see no reason why they wouldn't. I think Charles will make a fine king. And my view is that New Zealanders support the position that they're in with the Queen and then ultimately the King as head of state. And one of the reasons we know that is I was the Prime Minister that brought back knighthoods in New Zealand, titular honours. And despite even my view that would be supported by about 60% of New Zealanders, in fact 85 New Zealanders of the public have supported that.
Well, interesting you say quote that percentage, because I could quote a figure at you, which is that the last poll I could find, 43% of New Zealanders said that they wanted New Zealand to become a republic and didn't want Prince Charles to become head of state.
Well, there's always some random poll that you can draw from, but that's not the feedback we get on the ground. There is absolutely no push for New Zealand to become a republic. There's certainly no anti-Prince Charles movement in New Zealand. There will always be those who believe that New Zealand should become a republic. There's a Republican movement in New Zealand, just as there is in Australia and other countries. And as I say, in the fullness of time, some people might consider that to be the right place to go, but is that the big issue that New Zealand's facing in 2011? I'd strongly suggest to you it's not.
Prime Minister John Key, thanks very much for being on Hardtalk.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister.